Lang. This is Tuesday, November the 5th, 2002. We're at the Air Force Museum, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. We're interviewing Felix Weil. Now, if you could tell us where and when you were born, please.
Okay. I was born in Frankfurt, Germany, 27, and I lived in Germany until the age of 11, when I was placed on what they call Kindertransport to go to England. And I had to leave Germany by myself, without my family, without my parents, and without my sister. The Kindertransport consisted of 10,000 children between the ages of 2 and 16 that were taken by the British government as long as someone in England would vouch for them, in other words, take care of them in their homes. These were basically Jewish children leaving Germany. There was a very long waiting list, and my turn didn't come until August of 1939, which was actually 3 weeks before the war broke out in Europe, when Germany invaded Poland. In fact, I was on the one before the last transport. The transport started after Crystal Night. You might have heard of Crystal Night. That was in November of 1938. And the trains were coming from December of 1938 until the end of August of 1939. Train after train after train of kids that would leave Germany and were allowed to go to England. As children, we, of course, had absolutely no idea that we would never see our families again. Out of those 10,000 kids, 10% only ever saw their families again. 90% were never reunited with their families again. The families were later sent on trains not going west or north to England, but east to Poland, to the concentration camps. As I said, I left on the 10th of August, and of course, we were all a happy-go-lucky bunch of kids. None of us, and I've met a lot of people since, in the last few years we had reunions and so forth of people that were on these Kindertransports. None of us had any notion whatsoever that we would never, we were all told by our parents that they would come join us in a matter of a few weeks. Then I arrived in England, and my story becomes extremely strange there, and I might as well bring that in too while we're on the subject. Every child that came on these trains was supposed to have someone in England that would vouch for them, that would take care of them, would feed them, house them, clothe them, send them to school while they were there. And on the train from Harwich to London, all the kids were talking about who would meet them in London, and I absolutely had no knowledge of my parents telling me anything about who was going to meet me in London. Finally, when we arrived in London, every kid was taken off the train, and we stood on the platform by relatives or friends, and I was the only child left, and I was, of course, getting extremely scared and nervous and frightened. Couldn't speak a word of English, and there was no one there to take care of me. And finally, people from the organization, the volunteers, came over to me, and they would ask me my name. I would tell them it's Felix Weil, and they frantically started looking through their documents and papers to see who was there to meet me. And they discovered that the whole thing was a big mistake, that a girl by the name of Felicia Weil, who wasn't a relative of mine, wasn't my sister. Many people think that must have been my sister, but wasn't. That this Felicia Weil was supposed to have been on this train instead of me. And if it hadn't been for that error that occurred with that paperwork, it's a clerical error, it's easy to imagine that Felix and Felicia Weil were next to each other on some master list. If it hadn't been for that, I wouldn't be here today telling you the story, because my family, mother, father, and sister, about 2 years later, were deported from Frankfurt to a ghetto in Poland, the name of Lodz, and then from there on to the concentration camp. So of course I never got to see my family again. Anyway, to make the story short, not to go on too long, they finally had to decide what to do with me. They couldn't send me back, and I lived in a hostel in London for 3 weeks, and then the war broke out, and I was evacuated to the Midlands, and I lived with the most wonderful Christian family that took care of me and 2 other boys that were in the same predicament. They had come on the kinder transport, and I lived there for the entire duration of the war. We did a lot of things at that time, not only going to school, of course, and when I was in the Boy Scouts, and we used to go and volunteer for duty to go on in the mornings when the air raids started to go to Germany, and the B-17s and the B-24s started coming back, and of course British planes too. And we'd go on the YMCA van as Boy Scouts and help. And when the pilots and the crew came back, we'd give them coffee and donuts and cigarettes and toothpaste and toothbrush, whatever they might need. So that was our contribution to the war. And we, of course, see thousands of planes after they started bombing Europe, Germany in particular, of course, leave and come back in the mornings, and they've all shot up, the planes, and tails missing, parts of wings missing, engines missing, all kinds of things, and lots of planes missing entirely. Anyhow, not to go on forever, I lived in England for the entire duration of the war, and then after the war I was allowed to come to the United States, where I had relatives. My mother's sister lived in New York, and my mother's brother lived in California, and they were able to have me come to the United States. This happened not till the end of the war, just a week or 2 before the war ended. When I came to the United States, I was here for about 1 year, and then I was drafted in the Army. At that time, there was no, you didn't have to be a citizen. In fact, it didn't make any difference if you were a citizen of the United States or not, as long as you were a resident of the United States, and even if you came from a country like Germany, which was considered enemy alien at that time. Everyone was drafted. They needed thousands and thousands of GIs to replace the soldiers that had been there during the war, both in Germany and in Japan, of course. After having my basic training in Camp Lee, which is now Fort Lee in Virginia, I was sent to Germany, and you can imagine what an emotional experience it was for me coming back to this country and being back among these German people that I certainly didn't have any love for at that point, because I didn't realize until I came back to Germany what had happened to my family. It had been kept, all the Holocaust and the concentration camps had been kept very quiet and very secret, and there was always hope that I would be reunited with my family. But of course, by the end of the war, everyone knew pretty much what had happened in the concentration camps, that 6 million people had died, and so on and so forth. And we landed at Bremerhaven in northern Germany, the Baltic Sea, and actually it wasn't the Baltic Sea, it was the North Sea. And from there I was taken to Marburg, a little town, and awaited orders to go to a permanent assignment, which came about a week or 2 after I was there. And sure enough, it was Frankfurt, the city where I'd been born. And I got on a train by myself, because there were lots of other GIs, of course, but everyone had different assignments. And when I got off the train in Frankfurt, I was within a few yards of the very same spot where I had last seen my family 7 years prior. And I'm sure you can understand how emotional and devastating it was to be there all by myself in the same spot where I'd last seen my family. There were a lot of other GIs around there, but I never told them my story. I felt that it wasn't of any interest to them. They had their own problems, and of course, so I bore all this myself, the burden of being there, and I stood there for quite some time and looking at these faces, these Germans, which by now no longer wore these fancy Nazi uniforms. They no longer were strutting around the streets. They were no longer arrogant like they had been before the war. They had lost the war. They were cold and hungry and looking for handouts, and of course cigarettes was the currency most frequently used. And I would look at them and wonder who were the Nazis that had been responsible and been in the camps and were the killers of my family and of course millions of other people. And of course everyone that you spoke to would say, oh, I was never active in the Nazi Party. I was in an office, I was working in the fields and this and that, so forth. So it was quite a difficult. Do you have any question when they ask me before I go on? Please do, because I seem to be taking an awful lot of time doing this.
At that time, Frankfurt was it
completely destroyed.
level?
Right.
And here was your hometown.
Right.
And when you left as a boy, it was a thriving town full of bustle and promise and people
Exactly.
with plans. And you came back to a different world. Did any of the German people realize that you were a German man who was Jewish?
No, because I never told them anything.
So you didn't tell anything, but
No.
you were curiously looking around, trying to get answers for
Right.
yourself and trying to understand. Did anyone ever try to explain what happened? That all this could actually occur? What happened in their culture, in their thinking, in their psyche, that somehow this horrible, unthinkable atrocity could have happened? Did anyone have any words for you, any explanation?
Well, first of all, I want to go back to what you said coming there, which was, again, a very emotional experience to see Frankfurt the way it was. As I walked out of the main station, the old part of the city is very close by. It was very beautiful, old houses and old buildings and the cathedral and so forth. And now you could actually see from the, and I have some pictures, and I really probably should have brought them in for this documentation, where it's nothing but rubble, and then for miles you can see from the main station to the Main River, which is probably about a mile or two. There's nothing flat, and it's a shame I didn't bring in these pictures. And in my youth, until these terrible events took place with the Nazis, I had a wonderful childhood and was very happy in Frankfurt. And we used to have bicycles and bicycle all over town as little kids and go to different places. In fact, one of the places was the Rhine-Main airport, where they had the Zeppelins, and the Germans had the two major, the Hindenburg and the Graf Zeppelin. And as kids, we would go on these airships, and you could buy postage stamps and have special mailings of postcards sent back to you when these airships would go on trips. So all this was part of my life. In fact, I still have these postcards, and perhaps should have brought those in too. I really had no idea what we were going to do here. But coming back to the second question that you asked, no, it was really never explained. The only explanation there is, of course, is that there was always rampant anti-Semitism in Germany going back long before Hitler. And when Hitler condoned this, and when the government actually enforced the anti-Semitism and decided to get rid of all the Jews and then later kill them, the people, basically as a large number of people, were very happy about this and really didn't have any kind of bad feeling about it at all. I'm sure there were some people that didn't, but Germany supported Hitler until the very day that he committed suicide. And there were hundreds of thousands of not only military but civilian people that participated in the Holocaust. And from those running the trains, from those working toward rounding up people in these cities, from those, of course, that worked in the concentration camps, there was no end to. And they weren't all young, brainwashed people. You might say, well, they were all very young. They were brainwashed by the Nazis. Many of the people in these camps were older, were in their 40s or 50s, and they participated too.
Now, did your comrades, your American comrades now, soldiers with you, they knew you were German?
No.
They did not know you were German?
In fact, it's very strange. When I was there, as I told you, I lived in England for 5 years. I had a real good English accent when I came to the United States. People I lived with made sure that we learned English very thoroughly and were very careful and that we learned the grammar and the diction and everything else. And they didn't want anybody with German in their home. Germans weren't too popular. So by the time I came to the United States, I spoke real good. By good, I mean Oxford-type English. And most of my friends thought I was actually English, had been born in England. They didn't have any idea that I had been born in Germany. And when I came back to Frankfurt, the interesting part was that I still knew my way around the city very well. And we went on, as we were in our early days arriving in Frankfurt, and we would take a Jeep and drive around town. And some of my buddies that had come with me. And after a little while driving around town, they would say, oh my God, we're lost. We don't know where we're going. How are we ever going to find our way back to the barracks? And if I was driving, I would say, don't worry, I can find my way back. It's no problem at all. They would wonder, how on earth do you know how to find your way back? And I said, well, I've been in Frankfurt now for 3 days, and after 3 days, you know your way around town. And they couldn't possibly realize that I had been born there. So that was one of the amusing things that I never let on. And other things, of course, there was an awful lot of black marketing going on. German people would try to sell you a camera or a typewriter or some object, and they would sidle up to a group of GIs and they would talk to each other and say, oh, these guys are easy target, we can get all kinds of money or cigarettes out of them, we shouldn't give our stuff away. And all of a sudden I would interrupt them in a perfect German and say, I wouldn't be so sure whether these guys are such easy targets. And they would sort of be taken aback that I would speak, and they would ask me, where did you learn your German? I said, I went to school in the United States, and after a year and a half of German in school, you understand the language perfectly.
What was your job with the Army?
I was in the Corps of Transportation, but I was in an office working with personnel documents. And I took care of personnel records of GIs of the battalion that I was attached to. And this was wonderful because there was so many GIs in Germany at the time, and actually a lot of the menial office work was done by German girls, and there wasn't that much for us really to do. So I somehow took care of a lot of our documentation for furlough and leaves. And one of the records was my own that was in the group. And somehow my furloughs never got written down on my own records, being that I took care of them, so I was always eligible. And I took advantage of it and took a lot of trips to Switzerland and Italy, Paris and things like that, for 3-day leaves, weeks furlough and so forth. And my commanding officer knew exactly what I was doing, and he really didn't care that I took time off to go on these trips. And it was wonderful, because in those days, any GI could go on any train, any time, day or night, without ever having to pay a penny. You were allowed to travel. So as long as you had papers giving you permission to go on these trips, you could go anywhere. And the cost in these cities wasn't that high, especially if you had cigarettes and so forth. And it was very easy to make friends with girls and other people in these cities when you were there, so it was lots of fun. I had a good time.
Was Europe just devastated at the time, or were they rebounding and happy to be?
Well, Paris and
free?
Rome, and I went to Switzerland a lot, which was of course never touched. And it was like you'd never seen more Switzerland, and you could go skiing, do other things. And Paris and Rome certainly were not devastated by any means. Paris was never bombed at all. There was no devastation there. So the only real devastation I saw would be in Germany itself, Frankfurt and other cities.
How did you feel about serving America?
I was very happy to do it, and certainly was very proud to be in the United States Army, because this was the first time that I was accepted and was one of the boys, so to speak. When I was in Germany, I was always the Jew and was always left out of everything. I wasn't allowed to be in the Hitler Youth, of course, because I was Jewish. And as a 10 and 11-year-old kid, you saw all these little boys marching around in their beautiful uniforms and their knives and their weapons and whatever they had, and you wanted to be part of something. Of course, I wasn't. When I came to England, I was German. I wasn't allowed to be in the cadets in the high school because I was an enemy alien. I had to be, they had the cadets and the officers training and so forth. And I wasn't allowed to be in that. I was a foreigner, I was an enemy alien and so forth. I had to be in the gardening club instead, which was boring. But when I came to the United States, I finally was part of something. And I was part of the army, and I certainly wasn't, even though a lot of guys made fun of me and my ability, my English being different from theirs. And some of the guys, of course, later on realized where I'd come from. When I made close friends, I would tell them my whole stories, but I didn't go around talking too much about my background.
How did your friends respond when they found out your story?
Most of them were very sympathetic and realized what I had been through. And some of them, of course, had no idea of what had gone on. And in some cases, it wasn't so great. There was always some amount of anti-Semitism, even in the American Army. I will never forget being on a streetcar in Germany, and one of the GIs going up to the conductor on the streetcar, and I think he was pretty well drunk or something, but he said that the only good thing that Hitler ever did was kill the Jews, so that didn't make me feel too good. And I mean, there's always anti-Semitism wherever you go, so hopefully it's dying at a point where it's dying out now and it's no longer around, but even today there's some anti-Semitism.
You say here that you received 2 medals for your service?
Yes.
What's the World War II Victory Medal?
That everybody received. Though my medals are not of any, I just wrote it down because I have them, but they're not of any personal heroism or anything that I did as a soldier. Everybody got the World War II Victory Medal that served at that time, and if you served in the Army of Occupation Medal, of course, I received for serving in Germany.
And then did you leave the Army after that, 1947?
Yes.
You were discharged and you went on with your life.
Right. And I was very happy to be able to get, you might have heard of GI Bill, and I was able to go to college from my GI Bill and was able to continue my education. It certainly came in very handy because I didn't have very much money at that time, and doubt if I, without the GI Bill, would have ever been able to go to college and complete it.
And what did you study?
I studied accounting, business administration and accounting at Kent State University in Kent, Ohio. And
did you live here in Ohio then,
yes,
from then on?
Graduated in 1950 and came to Dayton and lived here ever since.
You have an amazing story. Do you have people today that sometimes question whether these atrocities really happened?
Oh yes, absolutely.
And how does that make you feel after all this, to hear people think that it didn't really happen?
Well, it certainly doesn't make you feel good, and you try to explain to people that there's so much overwhelming evidence to the fact that it happened. I mean, we have pictures, and even concentration. I took my children about 4 years ago to Auschwitz. I wanted them to see what had happened to their grandparents. And when you go to Auschwitz, which is just one of many camps, and see the torture chambers and the gas chambers, some of them are destroyed. The Germans tried to destroy, of course, everything as they were leaving. Many of the the gas chamber, the crematorium were not destroyed. They didn't have the time to do it. The Russians were invading, of course, Germany very rapidly. Germans had to flee very quickly. So you can actually see all these things. And when you see these torture chambers, what they had devised, I mean, it's just mind-boggling that the human mind can even think of things like that to take place.
How did your children react?
My children, until they grew up, we had very little discussion about it. We never hid anything, but we didn't delve into all these stories. And I wanted them to lead normal lives, which they did. They went to school, they went to college. My son went to Duke, and he went to law school there, and he did extremely well. My daughter went to Tulane, and then got a master's at Duke, so they did very well. But when they were adults, we took them to Auschwitz, and by then, of course, they knew. They were very emotional about it, and their reaction was probably almost as much as mine.
Do you think that their life has been better here? Have they experienced any of this anti-Semitism that you grew up with?
I don't think so. I really feel that they don't even realize, they can't even understand what anti-Semitism means. They've read about it, they've heard about it, they've seen it maybe, but their lives are so normal, if that's the right word, I'm not sure, that they never even give it any thought. And they never even think about the fact that as children we would have to, if we were out in public or in different places, perhaps hide the fact that we were Jewish, or if we were in a theater or something like that, and people would question us and look at us. They don't even think of these kind of things, that they would even have to hide.
Did you have to wear the star?
No, I left in 1939. That didn't become effective until 1941.
Now you volunteer here at the museum and you give a lot of information, especially about the Holocaust, to people who come through here. What's your message, Felix? What would you like to tell Americans of the future about that time?
Well, first of all, I not only do it here, but I've also done it in Germany. I've gone back many summers and my German had to be brushed up and to relearn. When I go there, I have a lady in Germany that helps me when I come across words that I don't remember or don't even know, and talk to high school kids. And here we talk to high school kids and even younger kids and tell them my story. And it's amazing, the response. And just the other day, one kid came and they write you little letters and thanking you for talking to them and so forth. And what's most interesting, when I got a letter from a little girl that said, the first thing I did when I went home tonight after hearing you talk is hug my mom and dad and thank them for what a wonderful life I have with them, and made them feel aware that they're so lucky that they can have such a life with their family. So I felt, even if it's only one kid, I certainly got across to this little girl. And the whole idea, the message is to realize how useless and terrible bigotry and that type of thing is taking place, and that we have to learn to get along with each other, and that we're all children of God, and we all have a right to be on this earth. And we don't all have to love each other. We all have differences, which is fine, but we all have to respect each other. And if the kids can learn that, that is the message I'd like to give them.
How did the German children receive your message?
They are very interested and extremely polite, and the first thing they all ask is, are we held responsible for what happened all these years ago? And I tried to tell them, no, you're 2 generations removed. It wasn't you, it wasn't your parents, it was your grandparents. And while I have no love for people of my generation, which would be their grandparents, that are now in their 70s, 80s, whatever, I can never forgive those people what took place, because even if they didn't participate, the indifference that was prevalent at that time, not caring what happened to their neighbors and former friends, that all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, these people would be picked up, and then in the morning, these people would find their neighbors were gone, and not doing something about it. Because if they had done something about it, and risen up as a nation, and not allowing this to take place, I think even though the Nazis had the weapons, and even though the Nazis had the wherewithal, they could have done, because the Germans were very much aware of public opinion. And when they had, for instance, the Germans tried to do away with the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church and have a German national church. They were going to have swastikas instead of crosses, and Mein Kampf instead of the Bible, and all kinds of things they started doing. There was such an uproar when all this took place. The Germans were very cognizant of that and discontinued it. They were afraid that there would be such a hue and cry, but when it came to the Jews, they didn't care. So, I don't even remember what your question was now. I got away from it.
Did you ever wonder why the other countries, the other governments, allowed Hitler to get so much power and get away with so much stuff before someone had the nerve or the courage to try to stop him?
Well, that's a very good question, too, because what really happened after the war, after the First World War, I should say, the French and British, and the Germans too, of course, their losses were in millions of lives. I'm talking about not money. And they were so sick and tired of war that they tried to appease Hitler. And in 1938, you may have heard of the Munich Conference, where the Germans were, the final thing they were going to do was have the perimeter, which was called the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, which was German-speaking people living there, wanted to be annexed to Germany. They had already annexed Austria, annexed the Rhineland, and various things. The French at that time and before could have just wiped the German army off the face of the earth. They were much more powerful, much bigger and better equipped army than the measly German army that existed until those days. And if they would have had the courage, and the British too, for that Chamberlain, you might remember, was the Prime Minister of Britain at the time, and he came back to England with a piece of paper from Hitler saying that this is now all we want, and we've achieved all our goals, and we're not going to do anything else, and finally happy, and blah, 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 all that nonsense. And the British cheered him. They were happy that he, Chamberlain, had averted another war. So in a way you can understand they didn't under any circumstance want to get involved in another war, not realizing by postponing this terrible event with Hitler, just appeasing him, it would be so much more difficult when time actually came.
And they allowed him to stockpile enough weapons
Right.
to nearly take over the entire world. And he couldn't have done that without people knowing
Right.
what he was about, and they just kept turning a blind eye. It just makes you wonder of all the people's lives that could have been saved.
Absolutely. There were not only 6 million, there were approximately 50 million people that lost their life in World War II. Not only Jews, but they were, all the gypsies were taken to concentration camps, gays, political enemies of Hitler, Catholic priests, Protestant bishops, and all kinds of Russian soldiers that should have been just prisoners of war were slaughtered by the millions. Russian towns and villages razed to the ground, and people, it is just, I mean, unbelievable that there's that many people actually lost their life. And like you say, if this had been stopped earlier, in the early 30s, could have all been prevented.
One last thing. Do you ever think about Felix Weil?
Yes. It was very difficult to trace, and the only thing we ever found out was that she was on another kinder transport that got as far as Brussels in Belgium. And as you well know, that Belgium and Holland and France, I can name you the whole map of Europe that was overrun by the Nazis, and all the Jews from every last one of these countries was taken to concentration camps. So what happened to her after that is anybody's guess. And I really, as a child, felt that I had no control of what happened to her. It's not, wasn't my doing, but it sort of leaves you a little bit queasy that you took her place. But who knows, that she may not have, she was on another transport anyway, and at the time that I left, she may have already left, and her name somehow may not have been erased from the list, so it's anybody's guess what really happened.
Well, if you feel like you got a second chance, you made good use of it.
Thank you.
And thank you for talking to us today.
You're welcome.
What a wonderful story. So sad.